Hi, this is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I would like to welcome you back to our lecture series for World History, World Civ 1. What we're going to take a look at today is a fairly large lecture referred to as the Roman Medieval Church. And what this lecture is going to try to do in a very abbreviated time period, it's going to try to kind of lay out kind of the development of the Roman Catholic Church, both politically and socially. Now, if you remember, we talked a little bit about some Roman popes in terms of other lectures. And what begins to happen, as we kind of outlined when we talked about, for example, the fall of the Roman Empire, is that the Roman Catholic Church, because of the failure of the Roman government, increasingly became more politicized. And it became a larger portion or a larger aspect of not only cultural society of Europe, but also political society of Europe. And when we talked about the kind of the development of feudalism, we talked about how the church kind of took up the role of incorporating the nobility and a lot of the upper elites of the medieval society into its leadership. And as we talked about that, I remember that we mentioned a couple of corruptions or a couple of problems that developed, like clerical marriage and simony. And ultimately, those problems led to a major reform movement of the medieval church in terms of the 10th century AD or CE. And that reform movement is called the Cluniac Reform, which gave rise to a larger reform that began to target not only monasteries, but also began to target kind of most levels of the medieval church as well as medieval society. And so real quick, just to kind of talk about it, the reform movement began in an attempt to remove what we call lay authority, or basically everyday people or secular people's authority over monasteries. And just to give you a little background information, the traditional pattern of what the Catholic Church and what the elites did in the Middle Ages was pretty simple. Having lived a life of basically being a warrior and having to do what warriors did, a lot of the leaders of the European society felt that in their later years, as they were approaching old age, they had to do something to basically get right with God. They had to do something to make up for their years of not following the Catholic Church's teaching about violence and about war. And so what they would increasingly do is, as they got older, they would actually create or endow monasteries. And then they believed that since they created the monastery, they should have authority over who would get to be the leader of the monastery, who would be an abbot. And more often than not, if their children or members of their family were monks in the monastery, they would elevate them up to be the leaders of that monastery, which we call an abbot. And the idea was that as they continued to do this, as they kept approaching the end of their life, eventually these elites, these nobles, these dukes and counts would actually retire, pass their kingdom off to their children, and then retire and become a monk and live out their last few days in prayer and dedication to making up for their lifetime of basically not living according to the teaching of the church. And so what developed over time were problems in the monasteries because of the failure of leadership and the lack of kind of protocols or rules regarding who could be abbot and why they were chosen. And so this reform movement of the 900s basically first targeted monasteries and put them under the authority of the papacy so that the Pope would pick who would be the leader of that monastery, not a local lord or a local bishop. And so that's how this reform movement began, but it soon continued to grow. And so, for example, once the monasteries had been cleaned up, then the idea was to actually clean up the papacy. And I'm going to try to get this out of the way so you can still see me, but still get here, I'll put it up here, but still get an idea of the power of this PowerPoint slide. Our next big kind of change in this reform movement takes place in the year 1049. The Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Henry III of Germany, basically was increasingly, worried that the leadership of the church was actually was failing. At the time, we had a pope by the name of Benedict IX, who was he was basically centered in Rome, and he was widely known as being highly corrupted. His administration of the church was extremely corruption. It was based on corruption, and was renowned for kind of bribery and kind of letting the rules and the laws of the church kind of slip by. Henry III then intervened. He basically went to Rome, had a meeting with Benedict IX, and basically convinced him through threat of force to step down as pope. And at that point, Henry III supported the elevation or the election of a former abbot of Cluny, that same monastery that had started that kind of reform movement. He advocated that the leader of that monastery, should be the next pope, and that pope became known as Pope Leo IX. And Leo IX was only pope for 5 years, but in that 5 years, he was tremendously active in trying to push that reform movement forward. He reformed the Curia, which is the papal court of corruption. He took that idea of attacking clerical abuses like simony and clerical marriage and other forms of abuse. He basically took that idea of attacking those abuses and trying to get rid of them to a European-wide focus. He worked to kind of clean up the church in all focuses in all areas. An interesting kind of aspect of his leadership was that pretty quickly he got into a fight with the patriarch of the Byzantine Church, known as of the Eastern Roman Empire. And the delegate that he sent to kind of negotiate a peace between the Patriarch of Constantinople and himself, the Patriarch of Rome, or the Pope of Rome, it eventually broke down and resulted in a beginning kind of war, if you will, without fighting, but a beginning war of words and of ideals that eventually erupted into the first breaking of the Roman Catholic Church, which we call a schism. Schism is the Greek word for breaking. That process began in 1054 and ultimately led to the split of the Catholic Church, or the Christian Church, into two separate churches, which today are referred to as the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. So Pope Leo IX did a lot to push this reform out and to make it more widespread. But unfortunately, in 1054, he died, and the reform movement didn't stall, but it took a new path. If you'll notice, the year 1059 is twice on this slide. In 1059, Henry III of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, died. And if you remember from our lecture on the early Middle Ages, what had been created in Germany was, with the death of the Holy Roman Emperor, there was basically a new election of a new emperor, and that would take a few months to get done. And so what occurred in 1059 is kind of interesting. When the emperor died, he was the most powerful ruler of Europe at that time. There was no other king even comparatively close in terms of authority or power. And so in 1059, when he died, the church, the leadership of the church, the pope and the cardinals, took it at that time, they made it a point to issue what was called the Papal Election Decree, which argued that a pope could only be elected and that only cardinals would have input into who would be the pope. In effect, what it did was it removed all lay secular people's power to influence the election of the pope. And so when that happened, that basically sparked a new tradition. We'd already seen under the Cluniac Reform that the church was removing secular or lay authority from control of its monasteries. They were now under the authority of the papacy. Now, in 1059, what the church has done is it has removed lay or secular authority from having any kind of impact upon papal elections. And so that's very important. That was step number 2, if you will. Excuse me. From 1059 then, for a few years, things kind of died down and the reform movement just kind of settled in. But then again, in a later event in the 1070s, that reform movement would reach its ultimate conclusion in terms of removing secular or lay authority from having anything to do with the leadership of the Christian church. This event is called the Investiture Controversy. It's fairly defined and kind of complex, but I'm going to do my best to kind of go through it relatively quickly and not bore you with a lot of the details. I love it. I think it's very interesting, but I do recognize that it might not be everyone's cup of tea. Very quickly, or very simply, what happened is we basically had the election of a new pope in the year 1074. And that new pope, he was a monk named Hildebrand, who came from that same monastery in France called Cluny, who became Pope Gregory VII. And then, basically, his first kind of act of business when he became pope was to issue a letter to all the rulers of Europe, basically telling them that from this point forward, all bishops, when a bishop's position became open, all bishops would in fact be selected by the Pope. So if you know a little bit about the Christian church, we have popes, then we have cardinals who elect the popes, but both the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops are in fact all bishops. And so the idea was that first the church got control of its monasteries. Secondly, it secured control of its papacy. And now it's going to also assume control of its leadership in the form of those bishops. And so this decree went out in 1074. And in fact, nobody at first really paid attention to it. However, it was extremely important for one particular kingdom, and that kingdom would be, again, the Holy Roman Empire. Because if you remember, when we talked about the election process, in that election process, there are always 2 bishops that basically cast a vote. And the traditional way that the emperor would control those votes is he would actually appoint the bishops. When a bishop died, those 2 bishops died, he would appoint their successor and thereby basically secure their vote for his son. And so basically when the letter goes out, initially nobody has any problems, and the emperor at the time, Henry IV, actually didn't have a problem or didn't pay attention to it. But in the year 1077, that becomes a problem. Because basically what happens is one of those bishops dies. And Henry IV, who wants to secure that vote for his son, basically appoints another emperor. He appoints another bishop. And at that point, the gloves are off, and the situation begins to evolve very quickly. When Henry IV appoints that bishop, Gregory VII writes a letter telling him he can't. Henry then responds with that letter by insulting Gregory by addressing it to the monk Hildebrand, which thereby means that Henry IV refuses to acknowledge Gregory as pope. Gregory responds by writing a letter to Henry addressed to the King of the Germans, not using the title Holy Roman Emperor, once again basically kind of pulling the recognition of Henry as emperor. Long story short, eventually the relationship breaks down and Gregory VII excommunicates Henry. And this is very important because when Henry gets excommunicated, it's really honestly the first time ever that a king had been excommunicated. And the people of Europe didn't know what that meant. In case you don't know, excommunication means that a person is kicked out of the Roman Catholic Church. And that also means that they are kicked out of their relationship in terms of being a Christian and having a relationship with God. And at that point, no one really knew what that meant because what was holding the glue that was holding feudalism together was honor, fulfilling your word, and a vow made before God that you would, in fact, honor your word, honor the contract. And so what Gregory argued is that by excommunicating Henry, all of those oaths and all of those relationships and all of those words that were given were therefore nullified. And Henry could, in fact, no longer be a king. He could no longer be a count. He, in fact, removed him as being a noble. And as time went on, of course, Henry found it increasingly difficult to rule Germany, to rule the Holy Roman Empire, when there was a large segment of the population that didn't believe he was actually emperor anymore. Eventually, Henry decided to confess his sins to Gregory. He found Gregory at a vacation castle in, it's called Canossa. That's what that means on the outline. And he wound up getting his sins forgiven. However, what this represented again was a big question mark, because no king had ever been excommunicated, and no king had ever been brought back into the church. So no one knew what that meant. Was Henry back as being king? Was he back to being an emperor? Nobody knew. The long story short is that Henry basically used his forgiveness and used his status back in the church to re-exert control and to basically re-establish himself as emperor. And after he did that, for the next 4 years, he basically attacked and tried to eliminate anybody who didn't stick with him during the problem or the fight with Gregory VII. All of that kind of eventually came to a head again in 1081 when another bishop died, and Henry once again appointed a bishop, even though he promised he would never do it again. Gregory again excommunicated him, but this time nobody in Europe actually paid attention because nobody wanted to go through the same process of having Henry get forgiven and come back and attack people again. The long story short is this. Eventually, Henry attacked Rome. Gregory basically left Rome and hung out with the Normans in southern Italy. And Henry appointed a new pope. But again, if you remember back, he couldn't really do that anymore because of the papal election decree of 1059. And so his new pope, which we call an anti-pope, was never accepted as being the true pope. Now, in terms of how the story played out, ultimately everything died down. Henry IV died. His son Henry V took over. And Henry V did not actually want to pursue a war with the papacy. At the same time, Gregory VII, the Pope who had kind of got involved in this fight, he had likewise died, and his successor didn't want to maintain a fight and a war with the Holy Roman Emperorship either. So eventually what happened is both sides compromised, and in the agreement called the Concordat of Worms, the city in Germany, basically an agreement was reached in which the Pope will appoint the bishop, and the emperor can then give his okay to that person by giving the person secular authority in the kingdom. If he doesn't approve of that person, he can then submit a new list to the Pope in order to get a different person chosen as bishop. The Pope can either choose from the list or pick someone else. But the important thing to remember is, even though this will take a lot of time, it can't take too much time, because ultimately, without a bishop in place, that piece of the church is not administered, and it's losing money, and it's losing people. And so basically, the process has to be done fairly quickly in order to ensure stability. So basically, long story short, in terms of what took place in these reform movements, the Cluniac Reform, the reform of the papal election decree, and the investiture controversy, eventually what happened is very simple. The papacy and the Roman Catholic Church ultimately gained control of its administration and gained control of the workings and kind of procedures of the Roman Catholic Church. Secondly, what it proved from 1074 all the way up until about the 1300s, what it proved, in fact, is that the papacy was, in fact, more politically powerful than the kings of Europe. And that lasted for a couple of hundred years, but it definitely kind of established the Roman Catholic Church as being the kind of supreme power of Europe. Now, along with that, what we had was a dramatic increase in papal authority, and the papacy, after 1074, increasingly began to seek and to kind of use new avenues to kind of demonstrate this secular power. And one of the greatest avenues, or one of the greatest ways they did this, is in that movement we call the Crusade movement, or the Crusades. Let me get that out of the way. And so that is going to be where we're going to kind of take a break in our medieval church lecture. We'll call this Medieval Church 1. We're going to take a break, and we're going to talk about the Crusade movement in a fairly good amount of detail, and then we'll come back and finish this lecture, and we'll call it Medieval Church 2. I hope this has not been too confusing. I hope it's kind of cleared some things up. If you have any questions, again, you can always email me, let me know. Thank you again for listening to this lecture, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.